The next step is having sort of done supply and demand, so to speak. I mean, cover the various areas of supply and demand, how it works on the market, and what happens when the government intervenes and messes things up. The next step is to go on to the theory of production or the theory of the firm, and how a business firm operates, and allocating resources to most efficiently to where the consumers most want it. The usual assumption is that the business firm tries to maximize its profit or its monetary profit. And I was going to go into the cost curve thing, but I think we can postpone that till next time. That's the sort of the dread cost curve thing, which usually knocks out of the box almost every economic student, and with good reason. At any rate, we've defined, just saying now, we've defined profits as total revenue minus total cost. And as I say, the usual assumption is sort of a classical economic assumption is that every business firm tries to maximize its monetary profit. And we'll see after this how this is most efficient and how this guides resources and all that in the market. Well, this has been challenged a great deal by all sorts of people, by sociologists, by literary intellectuals and such low-type characters. It's also been challenged by some economists, quote unquote. Actually, very few economists really get going to this all the way. I think even the most benighted economists usually will stand for this maximum profit motive and theory. The first big challenge to the idea that businesses are trying to maximize their monetary profits came in 1930 or 31 with a famous book by Burley and Means, Adolph Burley and Gardner Means, later became two eminent New Deal political scientists, diplomat and economist respectively, Burley being the former, Means the latter, in a book called Modern Corporations and Private Property. This is sort of the granddaddy of all the books that came later. Come down to the current big shot in this area, who's John Kenneth Galbraith. The idea being that, well, it's okay, in the old days, means in the bad old days, 19th century, it's true that everybody tried to maximize their profit. But now, because everybody had small businessmen, you have the entrepreneur owned his own shop, and so forth. So he was interested in maximizing profit and avoiding losses. So for the 19th century, it may be true the classical economic theory, in quotes, applied, was applicable. And you could talk about supply, demand, and cost and all that. But now we're in a new world, a new era. All the values have been transvalued, and the tables have been broken, etc. We're in a completely new situation. What's the new situation? New situation is we have corporations, and the corporations, the power in the corporations has been seized by the managers. The owners, the stockholders, in other words, are out of the picture. They have no power. They're sitting there clipping their dividends and, sort of doddering over the hearth. And and the managers, the real big shots, they're really running the whole show. They're the president and the vice president and all that. And they're running it, and they're not trying to maximize profits. Now, what they are trying to do is kind of vague in this theory. I mean, there are all sorts of theories of what they're really trying to do. The most plausible I can find is that the managers are really interested in growth and expansion. They're not really interested in profits. Of course, they can't take severe losses. That's admitted by everybody. Because if they start losing a lot of money, they go bankrupt. So that's the sort of constraint, as they call it. But within that framework, they're really interested in sort of a quiet life and also expansion. And they're presumably willing to take losses in order to expand. Why are they so interested in expansion? Because the more people the manager has under him, the more money he gets, and so therefore he maximizes his income by forcing, so to speak, force-feeding his firm to grow. So in other words, we have a disjunction, a split between the interests of the stockholder on one hand, the managers on the other. The managers have seized power. Now, interesting thing is whether it's supposed to be a good thing or not. If you're really a classical or neoclassical economist, you think this is a bad thing, because this is messing up the whole resource allocation process. It means that the manager is not really doing what he's supposed to be doing to clear the market and produce more hula hoops when the demand for hula hoops goes up and less when it goes down, all the rest of it. But oddly enough, most people think this is or many of these people rather, think this is a good thing. Burley, and really Galbraith too, when you get right down to it, but certainly Burley and Lilienthal, all the prophets of this new order, are all in favor of this. The stockholders are a pain in the neck. Profits are evil anyway. We want somebody, the manager is ready to stand there and has this growth thing. And also, of course, if you have a manager and you have to be socialistic, collectivistically inclined, it's fairly easy. It's fairly easy for the manager and the government manager, so to speak, the bureaucrat, to come into symbiosis until it's very difficult almost to tell them apart. So they have the theory that in these days, in the 20th century, etc., the whole thing have to rewrite economics because there ain't no real profit motive anymore. Well, there's a lot of things to be said about this. In the first place, we have to redeem the poor, the corporation vis-a-vis the old mom and pop grocery store and the self-employed person. The theory again being that in the 19th century, the self-employed person was interested in maximizing money profits, but the corporation really isn't. As far as I can see, it's the other way around. The mom and pop store owner had various other things that were pressing on him immediately. In other words, he wanted to make money. On the other hand, he was also leisure, he's interested in time off. There was also nepotism coming into the picture. For example, there are in many cases, you're willing to take a cut in income in order to hire your wife's brother. Sort of a classic kind of situation. Wife's brother might be complete ne'er-do-well, bumbler, and lose profits to the firm or the store or whatever. But in order for peace in the family, you're willing to accept a money cut in order for the psychic income that you're getting. There's nothing wrong with this. I mean, from an Austrian economic point of view, it's perfectly legitimate. But the point is, this means that directly into the operations of the store or the small firm, personal considerations enter in. Many stores, for example, on the west side of Manhattan, which is always my referent here, closed down during July and August, so the couple who own the store can go up to Lake Placid or whatever, thus taking a sharp cut of money income in return for getting a vacation. So all these sort of personal considerations enter very strongly into the 19th century kind of firm. On the other hand, when you have a large 20th century or larger 20th century corporation, these considerations tend to drop out or be very minimal. A corporation, for example, will have regular vacation schedules. You don't have to shut down the plant in August. A corporation will have less nepotism because you have to justify the moves to your other managers and the stockholders and the board and all that sort of stuff. So the tendency of the corporation is to be more profit-oriented, more money profit-oriented than the small firm, than the self-employed firm. So far, we've got the other way around. We've got neoclassical economics applying more to the 20th century corporations than it did to the old 19th century machine shop. Well, what else? Well, how about the stockholder manager at this junction? In the first place, nobody said, you see, the way that usually a straw man is developed here, the story goes, well, after all, a stockholder is sitting there, he's got no control, he's just, having a dividend. Well, it's true. If I have one share of General Motors stock, I'm not going to have a very powerful influence on the decision-making process of General Motors. No reason why I should. Nobody expects to. But nobody ever claimed that. No neoclassical economics with an IQ of over 20 has ever maintained that the small stockholder has much power. The point is that the large stockholders have the power. And if you get the large stockholders together on issues, then they become dominant. The small stockholders, however, do have power in another way. It's very important. The small stockholder, if he doesn't like the way things are going, if he doesn't like the profit record, it usually is of the corporation he has stock in, what does he do? He sells it. I don't like General Motors this year. Its profits are falling. I'm selling the stock. If people start selling the stock, small as they are, this means the price of the stock declines, and the big guys are holding a lot of stock get very worried because their value of their assets goes down. In this way, by voting with their feet, so to speak, the small stockholder does it. Decisions of the firm, even though not directly, not by voting, but by voting in the market, which in a sense is more powerful. So that's one thing. Also, of course, we should contrast this, the power that small stockholders have by voting with their feet in the corporations. Contrast this to the so-called publicly owned, and we'll get back again, I'll say later, to this process of government ownership, so-called publicly owned operation, where every citizen, by virtue of being a citizen, for example, owns the post office. Well, can we sell our shares in the post office? I don't like the way the post office is being run. I want to sell my share. Where do I go to sell it? Well, obviously, we can't go anywhere to sell it because we ain't got no shares. It's really government-owned, and the public ownership is a pure mythology by which the government cloaks its operation. And so we have the power in a private corporation to sell the share if we don't like it. We don't have the power in a so-called publicly owned government operation. We can't sell our shares of the public school system, for example. So, Okay, let's get back to the large stockholder, etc. It's in a sense, see, the saying that the manager is really taken over is focusing on a very narrow aspect of life in general and business operations in particular. I like to think, for example, one of the examples I like to give forth here is Nelson Rockefeller and his estate at Pocantico Hills in Westchester. If you're up there looking at suppose you go up there and inspect the estate for some reason, and you see the gardener, the head gardener. I don't know how many gardeners he's got up there, but anyway, the head gardener's out there and he's supervising the clipping of the hedges and the planting of the flowers, and Nelson Rockefeller seems to have nothing to do with it. So one could then, weave a theory that, in the old days when you own your own garden, and your garden was right there and you were handling it, you were running the garden, the owner. But now, you see, the owners have been displaced and it's the manager, it's the head gardener is really running the garden. And Nelson really hasn't very little to say about it. So from the laughter here, I can see that nobody's really taken in by this line of analysis. The point being that Nelson has other things in his mind, and if he should happen, running all of us, if he should happen one day to walk down his estate and see what are these crummy flowers doing there, the head gardener would be out on his ear. So the so-called seizure of power by the head gardener, if he really believes it, the head gardener, he's fool enough to believe it, is a fool's paradise. Because the ultimate power is in the hands of the owner, in this case, Nelson Rockefeller. Well, the same thing happens with large stockholders in the corporation. The manager can be up there riding high at the annual meetings and all that, but if this firm starts losing money or having a bad profit record, the large stockholders either will quietly sell or else they'll start giving holy hell to the managers and depose them, as they often do. So you have a built-in incentive. The managers, of course, know this, and they have a built-in incentive to make profits so that the axe will not fall. Another thing is another peculiarity of this whole approach is how do you grow? How does a corporation grow? The manager is supposed to be interested in growth. How does he grow? He grows by making profits. Pretty clear. If you make a lot of profits, one, the profits can be plowed back into the firm, and two, other investors will be attracted by this. So the way to grow is to earn more money, and therefore it seems to me there's no real contradiction between the goal of maximizing profits and growing. See, what these people would have to say is that the Burley Means Galbraith types would have to say that the manager deliberately grows too much and thereby accepts losses. I don't really believe that. I see no evidence anyway of this ever happening. The manager will build a plant twice as big, just even knowing consciously that there'll be losses or profits will be much lower. One of the pieces of evidence used by the Burley Means types is empirical questionnaire, the famous questionnaire form. As I suppose you know, there's a lot of snags in the questionnaire process. And what would be done with things like this, particularly too, I think, of Richard Lester, used to be at Princeton, labor economist. They'd send people out, or they go to various corporation presidents, and they'd say, is your motive in business to maximize money profits? And the businessman, of course, first of all, everybody's conditioned now, profits is a dirty word. And we'll draw back and say, no, of course not. I'm not. Profits? Certainly not. Profits is simply a means by which my main objective is to help the community and help the workers and cure cancer and whatever else. The profit is simply a small, something back there, sort of a necessary evil. Now, the thing is, the sociologist or whoever, the labor economist, falls for this nonsense and reports back, writes big tomes saying, from their own lips we hear that they're not really interested in profit. Paul Samuelson, whose textbook again, is like my third favorite book, economics book, but there's one good thing in there, in a huge, massive tome, which is, at least it was a previous edition. I haven't checked up on the ninth edition yet. And where he disposes very quickly of this theory, the charge of the manager being interested in growth rather than profit. And what he says is, he talks about this questionnaire thing. He says, look, the way to do it is to come with a completely different kind of questionnaire. You go to the corporate president or whatever, and you say, sir, looking over your decisions of the past year, each decision, in your mind, do you remember any decision where you deliberately accepted lower profits for some other reason, on behalf of some other reason? of course, the president invariably looks at the guy and says, well, are you crazy? Why should I do a thing like that? So if you look at the thing marginally, in other words, if you take each decision, each individual decision among a host of decisions, and you focus on each one, and the manager will say, first of all, why should I take a cut? Why should I, deliberately lower profits? And you wind up, of course, with the maximizing profit doctrine. So it's really much as in the way you put it. It ain't what you do in the words of the old song, it's the way how you do it. And so by simply changing the terminology and changing the approach a little bit, you get the correct answer. Well, there are other ways in which the manager's interest, and I said, well, and the managers can be and are kicked out. They're not often kicked out because they usually know what's going on. They know where the real power lies. I cannot believe, for example, that the Standard Oil complex is not really being, the major power is not in the hands of the Rockefeller family and their enormous trust funds in the bank and their banks, etc., and Chase Manhattan, operated by the Rockefeller family. I can't believe that they don't have the power, and the power really is in the hands of some guy who becomes president of Standard Oil for 3 years and then retires. I just can't believe that he has he's the guy with the power, and Rockefeller is sort of the schnook in the background. There was a famous case in the 1920s, I think, when the Rockefeller family didn't like the way the Standard Oil Company of Indiana was being conducted. The Colonel Stewart, I think, was the manager. They decided to kick the president. They decided to kick him out. Now, officially, Rockefeller only had about 10% of the stock. But, of course, he has a lot of allies. The Rockefeller family, by the way, always invests in tax. And this has been going on since about 1880 or 1890 when Rockefeller got started. And so he rolled in, by the time of the annual meeting, he rolled into Indiana with 80% of the vote or whatever and kicked out Colonel. There was no contest. There are other ways in which stockholders can exert their power in an unsatisfactorily managed company. There's a proxy fight. Current managers aren't doing too well. A new set of people come in, or minority stockholders, whatever, and say, look, we propose the following policies. In the next annual meeting, we have the big proxy fight. Now, this happens once in a while. During the 1960s, there was a great phenomenon of the conglomerate merger, which also speeded up keeping the managers on their toes, keeping them in fear of retribution. Conglomerate merger was if a company wasn't doing too well, if its management was sluggish and wasn't progressing very much and profits weren't very high, then a new high-flying company formed by some new people out of Texas or something suddenly comes on the market, offers all the stockholders an exchange of the old sort of built-ish company stock for the new high-flying ICT conglomerate or whatever, and at a hefty subsidy over the current market price. Now, the reason they're able to do this, of course, is because the conglomerate figures they're going to make a lot of money when the high-flying, progressive, hotshot management takes over and jazzes up the company. So they're going in that expectation. And so during the 60s, there was an enormous number of conglomerate takeovers on that basis, where the existing management suddenly found like their company, in quotes, shot from under them by the stockholders moving to another area. The result of this rather embarrassing, it's happened very swiftly, and the result of this rather embarrassing situation was that when the Nixon administration, for various reasons, which I can't go into in a basic economics course in much detail, the conglomerate merger phenomenon came hand in hand with the Johnson administration. There are certain similarities of investment ambits and so forth. As soon as President Nixon came to power, the entire massive force of government zeroed in on the conglomerates. The heroic antitrust character, who was the head of the antitrust division when Nixon came in, immediately started giving speeches saying conglomerates are evil and monopolistic. They have to be cracked down on. The New York State legislature passed a law outlawing conglomerate mergers in banks just at the time when the bank was about to be taken over by a conglomerate. And so the whole force of government started zeroing in on the conglomerate mergers of Texas pipes. And so the whole force of government started zeroing in on the conglomerate mergers of Texas pipes. Perhaps coincidentally, recession then sets in, and conglomerates do very badly during stock market recessions because they depend on seeing stock prices going up all the time. And as soon as the Nixon administration came in, stock markets began to collapse, and then the combination of the stock market fall plus the government zeroing in more or less clobber the conglomerate mergers, which sort of took many of these dotty, or I should say, sluggish managers off the hook for a while. But at any rate, that's sort of an extra competitive thing which was attacked by the government. Of course, nowadays, due to the peculiar tax laws, there's an extra reason why the interests of managers and stockholders are identical, and that is that many managers that generally get paid in stock options, or in stocks rather, of the company rather than the cash. The reason being, of course, if you get paid in cash, you pay 70% income tax on it. If you get paid in stock, you pay nothing, zero, until you can sell the stock someday, you or your children, and then you pay only 20 up to 25% capital gains tax. So, of course, the result of this peculiar tax law means that the president of General Motors gets most of his salary in General Motors stock rather than actual cash. The result of which is a happy identification of the manager's interest with the stockholding interest, because he's really more of a stockholder than he is an employee at this point. So we don't really have to, again, there's another reason for not worrying about this disjunction between owner and manager. Peculiarly enough, so I think this is fairly clear that the Burley means Galbraith. I should have tried to make this clear that the Burley means and even Galbraith are really in favor of this phenomenon, this managerial takeover. The only thing Galbraith really added to the thing is coining a new term called a technostructure to define this. The peculiar thing about it is that the Burley means Galbraith and all the other economists and sociologists and intellectuals who deal with this area, there's one big area they never talk about. There's one big area where the managers have taken over, but somehow completely dropped out of the discussion. And that area is the area of non-profit organizations. We can't make a profit where there are no owners. There are various organizations where there are no owners and we can't make a profit. In those areas, since there are no stockholders, no owners at all, there's no Nelson Rockefeller and there's no stockholder, no Nelson Rockefeller owning the garden, then the managers really do take over, and then you have a messing up of resources and all sorts of bad consequences. But these areas that they never talked about, for example, non-profit organizations, Columbia University, any college, is a non-profit organization, even a private college. The point is, nobody owns universities. They're owned by a board of trustees, which don't really own them. The board of trustees are not empowered to make profits. They can't. For example, Columbia could probably make a lot more money by converting some of their buildings into a parking lot and then operating the parking lot. They can't do that. It's illegal. So they don't, they're not in a profit-making business. They're not allowed to make profits. They don't own, the trustees don't own the Columbia. They don't get money out of it. They don't have shares of stock. Nobody owns it. They only direct it. They control it in certain ways. They don't own it. So here you have an unowned resource, therefore really not used very efficiently. If the resource is not owned, if you can't make profits, there's no real incentive to be efficient. We'll see next week when we get the cost. There's no real incentive to be efficient. As long as you don't actually go bankrupt, of course most universities are not going bankrupt anyway, so they're moving in that direction. As long as you're not actually bankrupt, who cares what the cost structure is? Who cares how inefficient you are, etc. And so we see that on the market empirically, the profit-making firms tend to be very efficient in market clearing. Government is completely inefficient and it messes everything up and shortages and everything else. And private non-profit firms are somewhere in between. Any of you who are registered at a college, for example, know what I mean by inefficiency. Now, Columbia, here we have Columbia, a pool of money. It's not just Columbia, by the way, it's any kind of non-profit organization. Columbia has a pool of money, which is sort of there for the taking. And the managers tend to take over. There's no other way out, really. What happens, for example, is that Columbia's buildings, it was discovered by the Columbia rebels a few years ago, and studied Columbia for probably the first time publicly. It turned out that the buildings were built almost exclusively by the Uris brothers, who were a famous real estate construction company, all right? But one of the Uris brothers happens to be a member of the Board of Trustees of Columbia. Another member of the Board of Trustees was a title insurer for the Uris buildings. A third one was a banker for the Uris buildings. You have a whole interconnection here where you tend to have a siphoning off of Columbia funds, of unowned but tempting funds You have, in other words, an ownership vacuum. There's a temptation to convert the vacuum to private uses, to private hands. So you tend to have, in other words, hanky-panky by the managers. And here's where the managers are really taking over. Nobody talks about that. Galbraith doesn't talk about universities or these beloved institutions. They're beloved because they're not making profits, I suppose. But here's the areas where the managers really take over. Another area, and this fits in with price control. This is Alchian's famous textbook, University Economics. Why is it there's always a shortage, a very severe shortage of Rose Bowl tickets, especially for the 50-yard line? It's deliberate. It's not an accident. There's no shortage apparently of bleacher seats. The shortage is in a very high price, very choice ticket. The reason is the Rose Bowl organization keeps the price way below the market price, deliberately generating a shortage, which means getting a Rose Bowl ticket is something like getting a seat for the next moon trip. It's very, very rare. So then what happens is you see the Rose Bowl as being a nonprofit organization. The managers don't have to make any money, don't have to be efficient. They price the good seats way below the market price in order to curry favor with the politicians, etc., whom they give the tickets to. Hey, governor, mayor, judge, or whatever, I'm giving you a 2 on the 50-yard line. Hey, that's terrific, Jim. I'll do anything for you, etc. It's that sort of chicanery that goes on really only in nonprofit organizations. The same thing happens with most of our life insurance companies, which are mostly mutually owned, which have an enormous amount of money. Columbia is a piker, of course, compared to the life insurance institution. Life insurance companies are generally not stock-owned, usually. So they're owned by whom? They're owned by the, quote, depositors, unquote. However, when you make your life insurance deposit, your policy, there's a little clause there in very, very small print saying that you are giving your vote for this life insurance company, your mutually owned company, in perpetuity over to the existing board of trustees as your proxy, as your permanent proxy. So you have a board of trustees, as in Columbia, by the way, you have a board of trustees, I should have mentioned that there too, which are self-perpetuating oligarchies responsible to nobody and nothing. In other words, responsible to no consumer, really, responsible to no stockholder, no owner, just sort of there, happened to be there at the right time 100 years ago, and are still there perpetuating their own kind of sort of monarchical succession. So you have this, of course, in life insurance, you have a fantastic amount of money. How are you going to allocate it? Well, as long as you don't go as long as you don't sink $2 billion into the ocean, and you don't completely lose all the money, you can do almost anything you want. The result is that the various financial interests, various banking and financial interests, Rockefeller, Morgan, or whatever, tend to take over the big insurance companies as managers, and then tend to make the investments in those areas which are Rockefeller or Morgan or whatever owned companies, thereby boosting the stock in those companies, to the detriment, of course, of the poor, suffering little depositor, the life insurance claimant or whatever, policy holder, who's the last person in the world to get any part of the action here. So, so this is the way the sort of the thing works. I remember one of the blatant examples of this, but this is only typical. This is one of the more extreme examples. Years ago, there was a beloved figure in, I think, one of the mutual life insurance companies, the president. Beloved, and I mean, every issue of the New York Times had a statement by him predicting stuff and talking about the insurance business. There was a big scandal some years ago about this because it turned out that as president or chairman of this big insurance company, he was assigning the title thing, all sorts of ancillary services that the insurance company buys. The title company or something was owned by his son, and it was charging paying the son very substantial fees, way above the market price for the service. Now this is inherent in the situation where there's no real ownership. Right? Everything is up for grabs, so to speak. Alfred Nichols, the economist at UCLA, I think, or used to be there, did a very interesting study some years ago of savings and loan organizations. And what he did was he compared share-owned savings and loan organizations with mutually owned. And the thing is, you can't do it. First of all, the federal government does not prohibits any federal chartering of stock-owned savings and loan organizations. So you can only do this on a state level. But it turns out that California is about half and half. California is more liberal in allowing these things. So he studied the record of the California private stock-owned, share-owned, actually really owned savings loan firms as contrasted to the mutually owned. mutually owned, again, is a situation where you're saving a loan depositor. You deposit your $1,000 in the bank, etc. You're supposedly a part owner, but you sign there on the teeny print a clause when you make your deposit saying forevermore in perpetuity, I hand my vote over to the current board of trustees. So I think what Nichols said is, well, we would expect by economic theory the following things to be happening. One, the mutually owned savings organization should be much more expensive, much more costly, much less efficient, higher cost per dollar loan. Secondly, we should expect a lower rate of growth because they don't really care that much about growth. It's sort of stagnant than the share-owned companies. Third, we should expect more nepotism and hanky-panky, more taking over by the managers in the mutual company. Okay, so, and this is exactly what he found. He found, for example, this sort of, well, he found the savings and the share-owned saving and loan firms are much more efficient and much lower cost per dollar loan. He found they were growing more rapidly, providing better service, etc. And he found all sorts of hanky-panky. For example, he found that the the mutually owned savings and loan associations tended to do something like this. They require you, as savings and loan, of course, is mostly mortgage loans. They require you, as part of the mortgage loan, to insure the title of the building or the lot with a certain company, and the certain company had to be owned by the president of the mutual life insurance, mutual savings bank, mutual savings and loan institution, or by his president's brother or by his wife or something like that. In other words, siphoning funds to the title into private hands, of the manager and his cohorts, and charging more, by the way, than the regular title insurance company would. Or another thing they do is the mutual. He found out a peculiar thing. The mutual savings and loan organizations tended to keep much more money in cash than the stock-owned firms. It'd be something like 6% against 3%, something like that. Very significantly big difference. Of course, if you keep your assets in cash, you're not making money on it. So why do they do this? Well, he investigated and he found out that in these cases, the bank would make a special deal with the manager of the mutually owned savings and loan firm and say, well, look, you keep a lot of your money here in this bank, and we'll give you personally, you the President Jones or whatever, we'll give you a big line of credit, we'll give you cheaper personal loans, we'll give you a special yacht or whatever it is. And so there's a lot of this stuff going on. It was never going on in the share-owned company, because the share-owned companies are close to the nub. You have to be making profits and so forth, maximizing your profits, etc. With a mutually owned company or a savings and loan company, you have much more room to play around in, so to speak. Of course, with government, you have unlimited room to play around in, because the taxpayer always picks up the tab. You don't have to worry about going bankrupt. You're in great shape. In government, the managers are totally taken over. Of course, Burley, Means, and Galbraith and their ilk never talk about the problems of government managers. The managers are totally taken over because the so-called owners, that's us, have no shares, as I said, in the post office or schools. We've got no say in anything. And we pay anyway, regardless of what service we get, because we're forced to pay through taxation. And so there, the managers really let them rip. It's all out for managerial takeover. But peculiar enough, so here we have a peculiar situation. Just as in advertising, we have a strange situation where the critics of advertising zero in on private advertising and say nothing about the obviously deleterious effects of government advertising or political advertising. In the same way, they zero in on the supposed evils or situation where the market is being messed up because there's no private stockholder power, or the managers have taken over, and yet say nothing about the areas where the managers really have taken over, non-profit, especially, and government, of course, areas. Another consideration in the manager stockholder caper is that this has been done. There actually was. I'm not kidding you. There was a request for a foundation grant some years ago by a typical empirical free market economist. The postulate was that the monopoly firms or government-regulated firms or non-profit organizations or whatever, in other words, the organizations that sort of out more or less removed from the market, would be less efficient and would have more perks going to the managers. And one of the ways of testing the perks was, this guy proposed to the foundation to go around making detailed research of the corporate offices of the various firms. You compare Con Ed with a free market organization. You compare the width of the rug, the carpet, and the in the executive office, and also he proposed to compare at great length the beauty of the secretary to the president and the chairman of the board, etc. Now, how he's going to do this, what kind of empirical test he would use, I never found out. Because unfortunately, whatever, the foundation turned down this rather pioneering kind of study. Okay, I guess that's the lecture for tonight.